Lincoln's first supreme commander of his Union forces was General Winfield Scott. Scott was placed in charge of an overall strategy to bring about the fall of the Confederacy and bring the southern states back into the Union. The plan that he proposed was called the Anaconda Plan, a plan to divide the South like a constricting snake and slowly squeeze the life out of the South. The life that he targeted was the economy, and to do that, denying the Confederates transportation infrastructure was essential. Controlling rivers and controlling railroads was how the North would make the South capitulate. Essential to the plan was control of the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the Mississippi rivers, as well as Mobile Bay. Moving troops by river, the Union Army could quickly move troops to positions from which they could assault railroads and industrial centers. A river navy consisting of gunboats, supply boats, and troop transports would be necessary for success of the plan. For both offensive and defensive purposes, both nations would have to put riverboat navies together rather quickly. Steamboat captains were mostly from Union states. They had developed such good relationships in the South, the Southerners considered them as being Southern. The Southerners were disappointed when the majority of steamboat captains, thinking of their best economic interest, chose to side with the North. James Buchanan Eads, a self-taught engineer living in St. Louis, had been advocating for the construction of ironclad steamboats for control of the rivers when he realized that a regional conflict was inevitable. While his suggestions were first rebuffed after the war began, he was approached to provide boats for the new Inland Waters Navy. Upon receiving a contract provide boats for the Union Navy, Eads went to work, and within less than 100 days he had turned out the Cairo, Carondelet, Cincinnati, Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. These boats became known as the City class boats. The USS Cairo would sink in 1862 in the Yazoo River near Vicksburg, Mississippi. It was the first American naval vessel destroyed by an electrically detonated mine. The wreckage would be recovered, and in 1977 it was put on display at the Vicksburg National Battlefield Park. The South had fewer shipyards and an industrial capacity far behind the northern states. A river defense fleet was established in the South in 1861. With fewer resources, the Confederates began modifying civilian boats in a number of different ways. They would buy, seize, and build any kind of boat they could. The earliest quick modifications for the river defense fleet were 14 commercial boats with a sharp ramming timber attached to the bow and cotton stacked on the decks as armor to protect the vessel. These boats would become known as cotton-clad rams. The principle of the ram was simple and based on the formula that defines force as mass times acceleration. While an artillery shell could have very little mass, it would have a great deal of force because of its acceleration. A ram boat would have far less acceleration but a much greater amount of mass. Ulysses S. Grant was recognized as the commander that could lead the Union forces to victory Due to his early successes in the war, the early campaigns were joint Army and inland Navy operations. Grant began his western campaign by first taking the Confederate forts Henry on the Tennessee River and Donelson on the Cumberland. Both forts were a short distance apart. Henry sat on the east bank of the Tennessee River near Paris, Tennessee, and Donelson sat on the west bank of the Cumberland near Dover, Tennessee. These forts sat on the edge of a narrow strip of land extending north into Kentucky that during the Civil War was called the land between the rivers. With the construction of dams on both rivers for improved navigation and production of hydroelectric power, the land is now known as the Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. It is a wonderful place for folks interested in history, nature, and archaeology. Grant took Fort Henry on February 6, 1862 by inserting ground troops from troop transport steamers north of the fort to attack while the Navy used the gunboats to provide a bombardment of the fort. Fort Henry was poorly positioned and floodwaters were threatening the fort. The battle was pretty much over before Grant could get his troops in place. The next thing on Grant's agenda was to use the gunboats to raid and destroy railroad crossings on the Tennessee. On February 12th, Grant sent his army on a 12-mile march to attack Fort Donelson. The battle started by first positioning his army in a half-moon around the fort and probing the Confederate defenses. On February 14th, the naval gunboats had arrived. An attempt was made to reduce the fort with naval artillery, but the boats were driven back by well-placed Confederate artillery. A surprise attack by the Confederates on Grant's right flank was repulsed on the morning of the 15th. During the night of the 15th, the Confederate leadership slipped out of the fort, leaving Simon Bolivar Buckner to surrender the forces. Disgusted by the action, Nathan Bedford Forrest took his whole command out, escaping by riding horses through flooded forests. Forrest became the most competent and ingenious Confederate commander in the Western Theater. General Buckner surrendered unconditionally, and Grant was given the nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant. The Union Navy gained dominance of both the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. With control of the Tennessee and Cumberland secure and rail line transportation routes severed at the rivers, Grant next planned an action deeper into the south at a town called Corinth, Mississippi. Corinth was an important target because it was the junction of two major rail lines that moved supplies from Confederate industrial centers to Confederate troops throughout the West. For this operation, the Navy would only be needed for transport. The port on the Tennessee River where the troops were landed was called Pittsburg Landing. It was near a church called Shiloh. On April 6, 1862, the first day of battle, it appeared that the Confederates were on the edge of victory. Reinforcements turned the tide. Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Shiloh proved that the war would not be a short and easy affair. Shiloh proved the importance of an inland navy. Troops transported into battle rather than marched in entered the battle less fatigued. Transports could move reinforcements, changing the outcome of a battle, and steamboats made excellent hospital ships. April 18th to the 27th, 1862, Union naval forces under the command of Admiral David Farragut fought past Fort Jackson's and Phillips at the passes at the mouth of the Mississippi to get 13 deep-water naval gunboats into the port of New Orleans. Sadly to say, the Confederate River Defense Fleet was reported to have made a very poor showing during the capture of New Orleans. Land troops quickly retreated to Camp Moore north of Lake Pontchartrain, and the artillery was sent to Vicksburg, where it became a thorn in the side of General Grant in a later campaign. On May 9, 1862, Baton Rouge surrendered to Farragut's naval forces. A battle was fought to retake Baton Rouge in August of that year, but was unsuccessful. Above Baton Rouge was Port Hudson. Port Hudson sat atop a 80-foot Lurch bluff. The region around the very small town was eroded, and the thickly forested ravines made attacking the small town, whose only strategic importance was the guns that controlled the Mississippi, almost impossible. Port Hudson would be taken by siege later in the war, but until that time the Union Navy could not control the Mississippi above that point. In March of 1862, Confederate troops at New Madrid, Missouri surrendered their position onshore and reinforced the fort on Island Number 10 on the Mississippi River. For 3 weeks, the island and supporting artillery batteries on the Tennessee side of the river received a heavy bombardment from Admiral Andrew Hull Foote's gunboats and mortar barges. Island Number 10 fell on April 6, 1862, the day that the Battle of Shiloh began on the Tennessee River. The next objective on the Mississippi was Fort Pillow, a few miles upstream from Memphis. The naval battle of Fort Pillow was significant in that the Confederate River Defense Forces put up a good fight. The city-class gunboats Mound City and Cincinnati were rammed by 2 cotton-clad rams. The 2 boats moved to shallow water because they were drafting too deep, and in the shallow waters they sank. Although the Confederates could claim victory at Fort Pillow, Union gunboats made it past Fort Pillow and destroyed the Confederate River Defense Fleet at Memphis. With control of the river firmly in the hands of the Union Navy, they were able to salvage the 2 damaged gunboats and put them back in service. After Grant's Army of the Tennessee achieved victory at Corinth and the neighboring town of Iuka, Mississippi, Sherman marched his troops to the Yazoo River to approach Vicksburg from the northeast, while Grant marched his men along the Mississippi Central Railroad to Memphis to meet up with the Union gunboat fleet on the Mississippi. Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. As long as Vicksburg was held and Port Hudson was held, then the Mississippi access to the Red River was safe. Cattle, horses, food supplies, and munitions from Texas could be shipped to the Confederate troops east of the Mississippi. In the Mississippi Delta country of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, over the millenniums, the river would break out, creating distributaries that eventually would become at least temporarily a main channel of the Mississippi River. Attempts were made to cut off Vicksburg from the Mississippi by first attempting to cut off DeSoto Bend by constructing a canal across its neck, but flood waters refilled the canal with silt before it was completed. The next plan was to cut a short canal into Lake Providence, which would allow passage to the Red River by way of bayous Baxter and Mason, and then Tensas and Black Rivers. The plan was to move troops to reinforce Banks' army at Port Hudson, but after all the work was done, the transports available were only enough to move 8,500 men, far too few troops to be effective at Port Hudson. A plan was put into action to get a gunboat fleet and army assault force onto the Yazoo River without approaching Vicksburg on the Mississippi. This plan took advantage of the many ancient channels that once were the Mississippi, but at the time were swamps and bayous. A crevasse was cut into the natural levee to spill Mississippi waters into Moon Lake and Yazoo Pass and get the gunboat fleets into the back swamps of the Mississippi Delta country. The route would go through Moon Lake and the Yazoo Pass, then Coldwater River to the Tallahatchie. When the Tallahatchie joined with the Yallabusha, the gunboats would be on the Yazoo River. The waterways were narrow and filled with lots of natural obstructions. Progress for the boats was only 10 miles a day. The boats were observed and harassed the entire length of the journey by Confederates. Movement was so slow that when the fleet reached a point on the Yazoo near Greenwood, Mississippi, they found a fort had been constructed just to defend against them during their slow advance through the swamplands. Resistance at the fort was so great that the expedition soon had to turn around and make their way back out of the swamps. The arrival of reinforcements resulted in one more try, but the commander of the reinforcements determined it impossible to complete the mission. Admiral David Dixon Porter made another attempt to move a small fleet, this time supported by troop transports, into the Yazoo by way of Steele's Bayou. The plan was to take a pass from Steele's Bayou into Deer Creek, then take the Rolling Fork into the Sunflower River. The Steele's Bayou part of their journey went smoothly, but when they passed over into Deer Creek, natural obstructions plus trees felled by Confederate troops trapped the small fleet near the Rolling Fork Pass. Porter came close to abandoning his fleet until General William Tecumseh Sherman arrived to rescue the expedition. The plan to attack Vicksburg by way of the Yazoo was tabled, and a new plan was conceived. Grant decided that approaching Vicksburg to the south would be the best option, but getting the troop transports past the guns of Vicksburg would result in a great loss of resources to complete his mission. One more attempt to bypass Vicksburg on the Louisiana side of the river was attempted with a canal constructed from Duckport Landing to Walnut Bayou. The passage would not allow for any vessel other than the lightest of flatboats, and floodwaters soon ended the project. Engineering remained the primary tactic in taking Vicksburg, but the next phase involved a land construction project. From Milliken's Bend, 70 miles south to Hard Times, Louisiana, a corduroy road, made by laying logs down the width of the road, was constructed along with bridges, and swamplands were filled. This road provided a way for Grant's troops to safely pass Vicksburg, while the gunboats ran past the guns of Vicksburg under the cover of darkness. While Grant's army marched south, Porter's gunboats slipped through the darkness past Vicksburg. Their plans to go undetected failed, and the Confederates opened fire. Porter discovered that the Confederates could not lower their artillery enough from the lurched bluffs to hit lower than the tops of his gunboats. Porter directed his boats closer to the bluffs, and the fleet passed safely under the guns. Admiral Porter assaulted forts at Grand Gulf, Mississippi, silencing guns near the river at Fort Wade, but found the guns at Fort Coburn out of reach. While the Battle of Grand Gulf raged, Grant moved 17,000 troops across the Mississippi to Bruinsburg, Mississippi. It was the largest amphibious assault the Navy had ever accomplished until the Normandy invasion in 1944. The following day, a joint force of Army troops and naval support comprising of a fleet of 8 gunboats and 10 troop transports ascended the Yazoo River to the mouth of the Chickasaw Bayou, where they shut down for the night. The following day, the fleet, minus one gunboat, ascended the Yazoo River, where they engaged artillery batteries at Drum Goose Bluff. While several boats took multiple hits, there were no naval casualties. On the other hand, Army troops inserted onto a levee where they took many casualties from the guns on the bluff. The following day, there would be more land assaults with little gain. Sherman eventually called the force back to the mouth of the Yazoo so that he could use the boats to move troops onto Milliken's Bend. While the bluffs on the Yazoo were not successfully taken, their mission had been a success. By attacking troops on the Yazoo, the Confederates could not move troops to reinforce Grand Gulf. Safely on the eastern shore of the Mississippi, Grant maneuvered his men around the city of Vicksburg and set up a siege. Naval gunboats would serve for shore bombardment and river patrol, keeping the rivers open to steamboat traffic. The siege would last until July 4, 1863. Vicksburg would not celebrate the 4th of July until well into the 20th century.